Welcome. I'm glad that everybody can join us for the fourth of our death series, an exploration of life. And today we're doing the philosophy of death. So welcome. Just a bit about me. I'm Beverly Carter. I'm a notary public. I have been a notary for over 7 years. I have a master's degree in applied legal studies. I have previous life experience, 3 PhDs in life, and I love my poodles there in the corner. I was hoping Puppy would be here, Abby. So we have a new 11-week-old medium-sized black poodle. So
Wow, that's wonderful.
yeah. So it's been busy at my house. So I talk about those 3 PhDs in life. I know that my good friend who is speaking today has a real PhD, but I tend to take a lot of my lessons from life and use those to bring it forward. And that's one of the reasons why I sort of became interested in this topic today. And then have evolved this into a death series, really an exploration of life and different ideas around that. So we've already done several today. It's the philosophy. It's really the philosophy of death or the philosophy and death. It kind of we'll explore that theme. We're talking with Dr. Janine Belmonte, also every day known as Nina. And then we have upcoming the Meet the Mortician, which is a very practical look around planning for death and putting that advanced planning in place as well. So today's talk, philosophy and death. And here you can just read a bit about Nina, but you can see Nina on the screen. Nina is a dear friend of mine. We met through our children, 8 or 9 years ago when you moved here. And we never have we're never lacking anything to talk about. Nina has an amazing knowledge of history, and we've had many discussions around philosophy and the concept of light and darkness and our whole Western kind of civilization, our Judeo-Christian background that sort of is very foundational in a lot of how we consider and look at death. We're not really morbid or anything like that around the topic. It's actually quite, I find it quite enlightening. And I thought I would love to introduce Nina to you, to get to know her and hear from her, because she's got lots of great wisdoms and is very informative and engaging. So welcome, Nina. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about Western philosophy, a couple of 4 different philosophers who have what they've said about death and what the significance of that is. I don't actually study death per se in my own work, but I have taught existentialism for about 30 years now. And of course, we always end up talking an awful lot about life and death in existentialism. It's one of the most exciting classes that I teach, and I really love it. I've also been thinking, I guess, a lot about this topic given the pandemic. It's been very interesting to me to see what a strange spin it's put on how we see our own mortality. And it's almost as if we're so focused on COVID that somehow we imagine if we don't get COVID, we're not going to die. We're really focusing only on this disease, which is very odd. But so philosophy in the Western realm doesn't really write so much about death per se, especially now, as much as human awareness of mortality. And I'm going to talk about that at the end. Okay, so I have some slides just to kind of help me make my way through here. Like I was saying, it's interesting in a pandemic to be thinking about this because, of course, even though we're focused on COVID, death is, of course, an absolute certainty for all of us. And in fact, and I think it's important to remind ourselves, everything that exists will cease to exist in that form at some time. Even stars have lifespans. That's a supernova there on your screen. So we're at the other end of that scale. But so to me, the question has always seemed to be, at least for philosophers thinking about death, is death an end? Is the soul immortal? That seems to be the real crux of the matter. And this discussion, of course, have to wrap around the question of whether the soul or your consciousness or whatever you like to call it is the same stuff or the same thing as the body. And these are the two kind of governing questions. And I'm going to talk about four different philosophers. I'm not going to talk too much about them, but I hope you'll ask me questions at the end. Two from each end of the spectrum about the soul's immortality and the soul's mortality. So it all starts with Socrates, of course. Everything starts with Socrates. There's a nice statue of him there. He was known for being rather ugly, and these are his dates, BC, of course. He was a gadfly, a questioner. He made himself very unpopular in Athens during the real heyday of Athens. And he was actually put to death himself for political reasons, although the charge was corrupting the youth. Um, and he didn't try to fight or escape. Plato had actually bribed some guards for him, but he refused to escape. And he said, death's going to get me anyway. So he was more concerned really about his accusers and what they were doing to their own souls in accusing him. Plato wrote a piece, a text about the trial. It's called the Apology, where Socrates says, look, I'm not afraid because either death is an absolute end, in which case it's a rest and not to be feared, or death is a transition to another life or another mode of existing, and in which case that place, wherever it is, would be populated by all the dead that I miss. And he specifically says, I'd be able to talk to all these wise men and like to Homer and all these people who I haven't been able to speak to. And so I'm not afraid of that either. So either way, he's not afraid. The key with Socrates here is that he doesn't put a moral significance on the afterlife. And that's key because it's Plato who really does that. And once Plato makes that connection, this is before Christianity, by the way, this connection governs philosophy then for the next 2,000 years. So Plato was a student of Socrates, of course, loved him very much, was there when he was tried. But he is the one who makes claims for the immortality of the soul based on the fact that, or what he sees, that the soul is not the body, right? And if you think about this, if you've ever seen the corpse of someone that you knew or someone that you loved, it's so clear when you see that is a thing, and whatever they were isn't there anymore. I remember being very struck by this when my father died, and it made it much easier to put the thing in the grave because I did not feel that was him. That wasn't what he was. So here's Plato on exactly this idea. Surely, whenever its own badness and its own evil are not sufficient to kill and destroy a soul, an evil assigned to the destruction of something else will hardly destroy a soul, right? So if someone can get totally evil and their soul doesn't completely self-destruct, then certainly the death of their body isn't going to destroy that. And the death of the body seems to be not connected to the death of the soul for him. Therefore, since it's not destroyed by a single evil, either its own or an alien, it's plainly necessary that it be always, and if it be always, it's immortal, right? So this is his connection. And he doesn't stop there, which is what's so interesting. He connects this idea of the eternal soul. So our souls don't cease to exist. And they also are like or akin to other things that don't cease to exist. This is where Plato makes a connection between knowledge or truth and the eternal nature of the soul. And this is a fundamental idea that kind of guides idealism and rationality in philosophy for thousands of years afterwards, right? So here's this famous cave image that I found this great drawing of, which describes this. This is the metaphor image of the cave. He says, our life, when we're alive, we are as if we were prisoners down here in the dark, chained so that we can only look in one direction here at this world full of shadows, imitations of imitations, right? So you see in this drawing, the shadows are actually cast by these imitations of real things, and the shadows are cast by this fire behind them. By the way, I teach this in my philosophy of film course because this looks suspiciously like a cinema where we see images of things in the real world and kind of mistake them for reality, sometimes even presidents. And he says, yeah, he says, imagine if we were somehow enlightened and we could get up, break our chains, and come up through, like these guys here, kind of come up to the top here where we could see things in the light of the sun and see the truth and know the good, right? So for Plato, the true and the good things are the things that don't come to be and pass away. They're the things that are the same always, like goodness or truth, but even ideas of things in the world. His point is that, you know, you see something, say in an art gallery, and you go, what is that? And somebody says, oh, it's kind of an artistic rendition of a chair. And you go, oh, it's a chair. And then by the idea, you know what it is. You haven't gone up and touched it or tasted it. You're knowing by the idea. And this is the idea that the thing that Plato is latching onto here. That it's our ideas and numbers, things like numbers and things that don't change, that give us true knowledge of the world. And of course, this connection then, this metaphor is all pervasive in Western society. When I teach this, I ask students to think of all the words we have that connect the metaphor of light with the metaphor of understanding or enlightenment. You know, you say, I see, things like that. And even the word that, in fact, the word idea comes from the Greek eidos, which is a form of the verb to see. So this is a very ancient connection. And I don't think I'm exaggerating, it is nothing less than the ground of not just Western philosophy, but Christian theology and the idea of the immortality of the soul and punishment, reward after death, but also ethics, the idea that we must treat others well because they have a soul like we do, that is not just their body, doesn't depend on their circumstances, and that all those souls are equally valuable. Of course, that's all claims to human rights are made on this basis. And modern science, even though the scientists would never admit this, but that their push to mathematize all their knowledge is exactly this idea that you can't really know things by this messy world of things that come to be and pass away. You have to know it through these numbers, which will never go away. That's the true knowledge. And so, by the way, Plato also believed in reincarnation. And so the morality of this comes in for Plato, that once you die, how you come back or how you're going to live in the underworld will depend on what you did during your life. And so there's a moral connection that he makes as well, which of course Christianity picks up and grafts onto the Christian faith, and you get Christian theology. So for Plato, the things that are most real are those eternal things, truth and ideas and the soul. And the soul then is still a separate thing, right? And to answer that question in the beginning, then death would not be an absolute end. It would just be a change because there is this different substance of the soul. So I'm just going to scoot ahead. So you see so two at the beginning that are giving you an idea of perhaps the soul as a different kind of thing and death not as an absolute end. But then, of course, in the modern era, you get a change of perspective. And I've put Copernicus here. He's just such a handsome dude with this great hairdo, kind of looks almost like mine. He's a symbol for me of this rise of secularism and humanism, the idea that that it's our own observations of the world that give us true knowledge, right? So Copernicus says, yeah, Aristotle has this great theoretical idea of what the universe looks like, but it doesn't jive with what I actually see. And if I'm going to explain what I actually see in the most efficient way, then the universe, the solar system must look like this, right? So that's why he's so important. And so it kind of brings our knowledge of ourselves down to the debate, but what we know about the world is based on what we know about ourselves. And from this, you get more of a direction in the modern era towards empiricism and materialism. The idea that what I can know is what I can see and touch. And of course, this directly relates to how we think about death, because what we see is people cease to exist. We see their bodies cease to exist. And we put that thing that we can touch in the ground. And so you don't have to be a materialist to be an atheist, but certainly if you're an atheist, you are more inclined to be a materialist. So 20th century existentialism, which is kind of more where I teach, 19th and 20th century existentialism, is the extreme of this. So it takes that focus on the human individual as this basis for knowledge of the world, of ourselves, of our mortality, and takes it to an extreme. And so for them, a human being is a being who knows it exists, right? You're conscious of yourself right now. You're listening to me, but you know you're listening to me. You're aware of that. And somewhere in the back of your head, you know that if you are aware, there will be a time when you're not, that you know that you will die, which is a huge problem for human beings because we can't see and touch what happens afterwards. So for existentialists, a human then is an embodied consciousness. Consciousness then would be a kind of epiphenomenon of the body, something that only happens when these certain cells are together. And when consciousness then ends, when the body ends or dies. This also is a way to think about how consciousness might change with brain damage or something that you can't really think about, a solid, a sort of stable substance of the soul. When someone affected by brain damage becomes a different person, how do you explain that? That's very difficult thing for idealists to explain. So existentialism, by the way, has been so absorbed into our own culture. I always tell my students, this seems almost cliche because we are just steeped in it since World War II. But this idea of death as an absolute end doesn't have to lead us to despair or to nihilism. And now I'm going to just talk about two philosophers, both of whom were working during World War II. So that also colors, of course, the way that they think. One of whom is this guy is very, Martin Heidegger, a bit scandalous, a bit controversial. I can tell you more about that later. Has to do, with who that mustache makes him look like. But he published a very famous book called Being in Time, one of the most influential books of 20th century existentialism, or I think of any philosophy. And what he says is, among lots of other things, that we as humans, we have this sort of duality in us of we're aware that we exist, so we're aware of our temporality. Our being unto death is our way of being in the world. And this still, by the way, is an image from Terrence Malick's film, The Thin Red Line. If you've ever seen it, it's a way, it's actually about the Battle of Guadalcanal, but it is really about being in the world and being unto death. Beautiful, beautiful film. So for Heidegger, this human existence, which he calls Dasein, it's just some fancy German neologism. Oh, hi, puppy, which means, which kind of means their being. So we're thrown here, and what do we know, right? We're aware of what is, we're aware of the world, but because of that, we're also aware of the nothing. We are in the world and with the world, but we're also aware that we will not be in the world at some point. And so existence and our awareness of our existence is always wrapped up with our awareness of time. So for Heidegger, then, death is part of our being, and actually the way it's part of the way we might become more authentic for Heidegger is to accept that, right? The kind of being that we are is anticipation. He doesn't mean pleasurable anticipation here. He means that existing in time means that we are always on the road. Our present is always moving forward on the road to its ultimate end. We know it's there. And that coming to grips with that personally and profoundly is part of being a whole person. And so death is then the revelation of our own singular potential for being. So mortality and temporality are wrapped up in our own sense of what we are and what we might be. Um, so that authentic existence for Heidegger means facing our own most, he means, your very most personal, your own most possibility of your own death. And that's what the film, The Thin Red Line, is really about, that these soldiers enter the battle and they know people die in battle, but they are all sort of confronting not just, oh, everyone dies, but I will die, and I might die 5 seconds from now. And so this is really kind of brings it home, right? That there's a certainty and an indefiniteness about death that is the ultimate challenge, really, for human awareness. That I will die, and it could be at any moment. And if we are able to somehow authentically engage with that, Heidegger thinks that will give us a more authentic way of being in the world, of living. So Jean-Paul Sartre, who published his own magnum opus, Being in Nothingness, in 1943, basically says, pshaw. He doesn't think there's anything authentic about death. I know he's a bit wall-eyed here, and this is actually a fairly flattering photo of him, but but he still doesn't leave us in despair. So let me go forward here. He has a whole piece of Being in Nothingness, which is meant, he actually went and talked to Heidegger. He studied with Heidegger in Germany before the war broke out. And so he really is answering his idea of being in time, no, being in nothingness. We have to talk about this idea of nothingness. And he ends up with a whole section of Being in Nothingness on my death. And he says, who are we kidding? An end is an end. It's an absolute end of consciousness. So Sartre is basically thinking this thought all the way to the end. It's an absolute end. I'm not going to survive this. And it's absurd. It's not a final chord. It doesn't put this beautiful end on my life. He says death is as if, I'm a condemned prisoner in a cell and then I die of the flu. That's his example, that we're sort of always worried about how it's going to happen, and then we have absolutely no control over it. It just is a point that divides one thing from another. And it can't be anticipated then or expected. He's arguing with Heidegger here. Basically, I'm alive until I'm not. That's Sartre's idea. And it is very stark. It's very stark. But he also puts a focus on choices and living while I'm here. And so this is kind of the end of my little philosophical journey here for you. But he doesn't leave us in despair. He says we become parts of others. When we die, we basically become things that other people carry around with them. So consciousness ends, but what we are doesn't end. It continues to exist in others. And I don't know if you can see that. I know there's a little phone thing here covering up the grandparent's face, but kind of an idea that what we are continues not just genetically, but also everyone else we've ever been in contact with, right? Family, friends, acquaintances, students. And he says we each of us can be defined by the dead that we carry around with us. And it's actually quite a beautiful, fascinating idea. So you're not just the genetics of your parents and grandparents, or the way in which you were raised, or your culture, or the language you speak. You are all of that, but you're also everyone you've ever spoken to, anyone who's ever given you idea. And now, of course, Socrates, Plato, and Heidegger and Sartre are also among your dead, the way they are among mine. So I love this idea because it gives us an image of immortality without individuality, which and without an eternality of the soul. You don't have to commit to anything for this, and it's really quite beautiful. I put the question marks there just to sort of end on another question. So, if Sartre is right, who are your dead? And who will be carrying you around when you're gone, and what will they be carrying? You can see how that would also lead to another imperative to then think about how you live your life, rather than thinking about how you will end your life. So I'm going to end there on the question, and I will stop the share, and just we can talk, and you can ask me questions.
Great.
Or comments or complaints.
So let's just open it up to anybody who wants to, if you want to speak up, just unmute and start speaking, and we'll kind of go in turn.
I like
the puppy, right?
You know, a little humor there, a little comic relief in the middle there.
Yeah. Could you hear her groaning?
Oh yeah.
She was kind of a little yelpy out away from me, so she's okay for a bit of time, but she's still getting used to all this newness. So
yeah, so if they want to turn on their cameras or their mics, or either or, yeah.
I can certainly say that as you're working through some of these different ideas, where that I can see different parts of that in my life through different, like I've often thought that, the way I speak sometimes, oh, that's exactly what my mom would have said or done, or my dad, right? And the values and all of that. And I'm like, yeah, I can totally see that, how that works in my life for sure. I do find I'm still not seeing any questions, or if anybody wants to type something into the chat, that would be great.
Yeah,
I know it's a lot to have to sort of absorb, right? It's been a while since I was at university.
Really?
Yeah, Carolyn.
I was just wondering, that the philosophers you talked about are a little bit grim as far as their vision of of our death, perhaps. Are there any of the more ancient philosophers who have a broader perspective about the soul?
What do you mean by broader?
Well, perhaps that they see it as going on past the body, or that there's some kind of an alternate existence, that the soul is separate from the body, that kind of thing.
Oh yes, absolutely. That's what I said about Socrates and Plato. Both of them did.
Oh, they did. Okay.
It's just the existentialists who really lean hard and heavy on the negative answer to that question of whether death is an absolute end, right? Existentialists would say, no, you can only know, what you're aware of in your own consciousness, and what you're not aware of anything after your death. So you have to ground it there. But Plato absolutely, that was actually a kind of accepted idea in Greece, partly because of Homer, right, where you get a vision of the underworld in the Odyssey. And in other poems and myths, right, that you die and your soul goes to, like a shade, goes to the underworld, which is not hell. It's just a different existence. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought of that, but of course that whole Greek idea of the underworld. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Plato, really does base what becomes an entire philosophical mode of thinking on the immortality of the soul, that the soul is a different substance and it can know things eternal, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, in the Republic, somebody asks Socrates, how Socrates is a character in the Republic, that a text that Plato wrote, and say, well, how do philosophers arise? And he says, they are in love with things eternal. They're the people that love to think about these ideas, and they understand that that's the truth of things. It's actually quite a beautiful thought.
Yeah. Well, I love that image of the cave and the idea that we're not really seeing reality. We're seeing a reflection of something. But was he implying that the reality is just a change in consciousness, that we have to realize that?
That our soul itself is an eternal thing, just like those ideas, just like mathematical numbers, that it doesn't die, it doesn't ever go away. And so it's because it's the same thing, it's the same substance for him.
Okay.
Then it lasts, it goes on and goes on. And he actually, in the 10th book of the Republic, he talks about the afterlife, and that there's a morality to this, that, you know, the only thing that can destroy your soul is your own soul. The only thing that can make it, and not cease to exist, but make it worse. You can make yourself worse by doing bad things, and, you know, and being evil, and not understanding the good and the truth. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. That's very helpful.
I do have some other questions here in the chat. So talk about the idea of reincarnation and karma.
Yeah.
Do we find it in Western philosophy?
Yes, there's a lot of influence East and West, right? Because if you think, you know, just kind of imagine in your mind, even though you may not have the map in front of you, the first philosopher, Thales, is actually in Miletus, which is over on the eastern side of the Aegean. So East and West Asia and Europe are really part of the same continent until the Middle Ages, right? And there is a lot of back and forth, and for sure, Plato believed in reincarnation. That's where the morality comes in. Like, if your soul isn't going to go away, then you'd better get your act together, because the way you're going to exist after this life ends is going to be worse if you start, you know, taking the good away from your own soul. And so there is absolutely a lot of back and forth, but also people like Schopenhauer and Hegel in the 19th century. There's a bigger influence of Buddhism comes back into Western philosophy, especially through the Germans. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's another comment. The Buddhists have the same idea, and you just mentioned Buddhists. The Buddhists have the same idea that what we see and experience in life is similar to a dream, and that reality is somehow out there beyond our normal perceptions.
Yeah, and I don't know whether Plato would have had a sense of, I mean, he would have been getting a sort of cultural flow from the East. He might not have known the name Buddha, but for sure, you know, the Mediterranean is like this little, you know, pond, you know, in the middle of all of these civilizations, and they're definitely traversing back and forth, right? And of course, there's a Silk Road that goes all the way across to China. So there is a lot of sort of interanimation, you might say. Yeah.
So the concept, the light and darkness, you know, like there's a lot of this imagery, the language that we use and stuff. So talk more about that concept.
Yeah.
Black and white, you know, right? And the connotations that we have with that. So
yeah, we definitely actually, it's such a Western metaphor. It's all pervasive. Light then, because so many of the words that we have about, like the word theory comes from, theos is from God, right? Like there's a whole connection between what's eternal, what's light. Like the word idea comes from, eidos comes from the Greek word for vision.
mm-hmm.
There's so much of that is connected. And to me, as a philosopher, I think it makes a lot of sense, because if you think about our existence as humans depends so much on sunlight. I mean, just biologically, we know, and we also know that in the dark, we don't have the capability to exist well in the dark, like in the woods. There's a lot of sort of myth behind that, but then once the metaphor really takes hold, we have all of these verbs like, you know, illuminating the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, right? the Lumiere, right? The French philosophers of the Enlightenment are called Lumiere, the luminaries, right? And in fact, two of the earliest film makers in France were the Lumiere brothers, right? Which was ironically beautiful because here's this machine that takes light and darkness and makes another whole reality out of it on the screen. And it really does sort of remind you of Plato's cave image. And then it becomes, you know, people do talk about film as, so we see our dreams on the screen through the manipulation of light and dark. Especially you see that in black and white films, how they'll use that to really work on your emotions and the connotations of darkness and lightness, of moral darkness and lightness of the soul.
Mm-hmm. So how has the how has fear, where's that element of fear of death? Where is that starting to, how has that evolved? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, oops, was there another thought there?
Not for me.
I heard something. You know, it's funny to hear Socrates, you know, that quote from Socrates is so interesting because he reminds us that in a way, you know, what are we afraid of? Either we're going to end and then we get to rest, or we're not going to end, and then, you know, you're going to go on in some way. Oh yeah, resurrection. Well, I'll get there in a minute. I think that the fear comes from the fact that we don't actually really know. So if you say, you know, I believe the soul exists after death, it's a matter of faith. And so it's not something we can see and touch. Like we don't see somebody who's dead get back up. And you know, we can't all share that. And we might have individual experiences of experiencing someone's presence after their death, but it's not a kind of common human knowledge the way we can talk about, you know, the measurement of, you know, a tree, or, you know, we can't do the same thing. It's not objective. And actually there's an existential philosopher, one of the first, Soren Kierkegaard, who talks about that the anguish we feel is knowing that we are mortal, and knowing that our faith has to be a matter of our own relationship to those things that we think are true, and nothing can rescue us from that that inner life, that solitude of our relationship with God or with faith or whatever it is that we believe is ours. That's what Heidegger means by ownmost. He means, you know, the deepest, most personal thoughts and relations that you have. I don't, you know, resurrection. So Valerie, in what way?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts to share. I mean, you know, in ancient Egyptian philosophy, they talk about Osiris being resurrected. And I wonder if that come into Christianity, or is the whole idea of resurrection grounded in Plato somehow? Just wondering what your sort of thoughts are about that.
Well, so there's a difference between resurrection and reincarnation. Those two things are different, and they're interestingly different, right? To be resurrected, you're resurrected as the same person in the same body, whereas reincarnation is a similar soul in a different body, and that different body might actually affect and change. And of course, the body has circumstances, place and time, right? It might change your soul, and you know, sort of your soul might develop. I think that's kind of the Eastern idea of reincarnation is that each life you live actually changes your soul, actually interacts with that that existence, that bodily existence. Whereas resurrection, I actually, in the back of my mind, I feel like resurrection has its parallel in the seasons, in a kind of cyclical, sort of ancient pagan notion of, you know, think about when the holidays happen as well, especially in Christianity, right? Christ is born just after the winter solstice. So the winter, that's the darkest point, and the light. in the darkest point, we get just a little bit more light. And then at the moment when there's an equality of light and dark, the light wins right around Easter, right? And
That's
you,
very interesting,
yeah,
yeah.
you can almost say the sun triumphs
Right.
at the equinox, and then it is kind of resurrected. And I feel like that notion that that hope that we would be able to come back exactly like we are, that's a beautiful thought. Sometimes I think it's beautiful, sometimes I think it's exhausting. Sometimes I think if I had my druthers, I would rather just sort of not necessarily be myself after I die, but just kind of go into the sum total of, souls and what is, and be relieved of this, burden of carrying around my singular self and all of my singular decisions. That's another interesting question you can ask yourself is, if death could be anything you want, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nina.
I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think.
No, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I do have a question from the Facebook group here.
Good.
I don't know. I'll get started. I may have to press a button. I hope it doesn't go away. From Gary, how did the famous existentialists, did I say that right? Square their existentialists, thank you, square their self-indulgent lifestyle with Aristotle's notion of people examining the quality of your life after you died? Did existentialists concern themselves with the examined life?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Some more than others, and some hypocritically, or hypocritically in some ways and not in others. So you can take them all to task on certain things. Like Kierkegaard probably was the most Christian of the existentialist philosophers, and he really did live his faith. He never married. He lived in relative poverty. When he died, he was so interested in trying to sort of change people's minds and try to keep them from being sort of, lip service to Christianity, try to make them real Christians, that he didn't have any friends. He was like Socrates, he just pissed everyone off. But when he died, hundreds of homeless people came to his funeral because he spent his time with the poor and the downtrodden, and he gave them his money, and really an interesting figure. Whereas someone like Heidegger, of course, the reason he's scandalous is because he joined the Nazi Party, and so he was a very deep thinker and a very foolish human being with very stupid politics. There's also a slight sense that he might have thought of himself in a heroic role, like, I'll be part of this, but I'll do it in order to protect the intellectual life at the university, right? They made him rector. And in the end, they didn't allow him to publish his own philosophy. So he didn't gain much from that, and was kind of basically blacklisted after the war. He couldn't teach for quite a while. But and then someone like Sartre, who has an absolute notion of every choice you make determines what you will leave in this world. And you are absolutely responsible for not just your own choices, but the world you get. I mean, he gave his speech on existentialism right at the end of the war in Paris. And he actually said, you get the war you deserve. And you can imagine how this went over in Paris, occupied Paris, right after they were finally liberated. People came to blows outside. It was like a riot, but he meant it. But even though, he himself also, although he was very politically active and very lefty and humanist, he also was kind of personally somewhat unscrupulous in some ways. But, humans are humans. So what they say and think might be very different from what they do. Even Aristotle himself, probably, did own slaves and did think that women were lesser beings than men, but we still read Aristotle.
Just don't agree with some of his views,
What are you gonna do? Yeah, yeah.
right?
You take the good and you think for yourself and you make your own decisions and you decide what you will not accept and what you think is wrong.
Mhm. Hmm. Cool. Do we have any more questions on? Gary says, thank you.
Gary?
So we're getting into the very last several minutes of our exploration today. Is there anybody else that wants to chime in or pipe up or however else we can say that? I'll just give a moment. Is there anybody who just wants to share something, not necessarily ask a question, but just share some, perhaps how this has, if you see aspects of Nina's discussion today in your own life, or, is it helping you in any way? So here's a question. Do you think people can communicate with the dead?
Wow. I would hesitate to, I guess I would just be humble about that. I would say personally, I have personally felt the presence of people in my life who have died, but I couldn't tell you for sure whether that was because they live in me or because they came from somewhere else. Either way, I find it very comforting when that happens. But there is a movie, by the way. That's kind of the best I can do here. There's a beautiful movie made by Clint Eastwood called The Hereafter, and it's got the guy who did The Bourne Identity is in it, and it's just a beautiful film about a man who can communicate with people who have only just died. And he really does do a beautiful job of kind of portraying how strange that thought might be and what that might mean to different people. Yeah.
Well, I did do one of my first session in this series was talking with the mediums. So
Cool.
Valerie, I don't recall if you were at that one, but we do have it available on YouTube, and they would absolutely say, yes, you can. So, and I know from my personal experience, I had a spirit in my home, and it was a female, probably around age 40, and it was very clear, and I could hear her. She never spoke, but I could hear things. I could hear her sigh and different aspects. So that would be my input.
I actually had a very funny story. I have a very funny story. I was traveling in a car east from West Coast to East Coast of the United States. And I think I might have told Beverly this. We stopped at this place that was supposed to be haunted right near the Grand Canyon.
Yes.
Yeah, and it was hilarious. It was a 19th century building that used to be a whorehouse. And I don't know why that's tricky, but supposedly it was haunted. And we were coming up, we drove up the car and took out our suitcase, and people said, "You're staying there?" And we said, "Well, yeah." And they said, "I thought it was haunted, So that, okay, well, yeah, whatever. So we go in there, lovely room, and I was sleeping in this big bed with my little son. He was very young at the time. And in the middle of the night, I woke up because I felt something on my arm, and I thought that he had just rolled over and pulled the blankets or something, and that it sort of just touched my arm. And I kind of looked around, and there was, nothing there, and he was still asleep. And I thought, well, all right, maybe he just kind of turned over, I don't know, whatever. And the next morning I came down to the breakfast. It was a bed and breakfast. And the owner was there, and I said, "So what's with this ghost supposedly in this house? Like, who's this ghost? I didn't hear any chains rattling or anything." And he said, "Oh, no, people say it just feels like a little kid trying to wake them up."
Oh,
Said, "Oh, wow, I think I met your ghost."
right. Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
At which point my son was like, like, "Oh, no."
So That's great. Thank you.
So yeah, you can sign up you can actually audit courses at UVic if you want to through I think through continuing ed. But I don't know how this would work during the pandemic. I am teaching Intro to Existentialism next semester, and I might be, you know, if you email me, I might be able to just include you.
Mhm.
It's all online.
Great. Thank you.
I usually, when I give courses in person, I usually I don't mind if people sit in. I just feel like, you know, I don't teach because I get paid. I teach because I like to teach.
Yeah.
I gotta change my picture. I'm so black haired in that photo.
Yeah, I know. I remember. Well, talk about dark and lightness.
Now I'm Nina the White now, like
Nina the
Gandalf.
White.
Gandalf.
Nina the good. Nina the good.
Good.
So I think that's everything. I just want to thank everyone for participating. I hope everyone has enjoyed as much as I have. I'm sure that they have. And I love your suggestion that if people are interested in more, they can audit courses. Are there any other resources out there that come to mind?
There's also a humanities course. So there's humanities, I think it's 101 at UVic, that is a continuing ed course, and it's kind of a broad humanities course. I have never given a talk in it, but I know many professors do. And so that's lots of fun. There's also a Speakers Bureau. I think it's still running, it's running online, but you can look at who's giving talks on what, and if you have an association or you can just invite people, and it's free. You can do it through UVic.
So if they look for Speakers Bureau at UVic, they'll find who's available.
Yeah.
Well, and let's get creative these days, because you know we're all going to be indoors and dark nights, and we're wanting something to talk about. Okay, good. Well, thank you all for attending. I just want to say that our next, I don't think I should, this is, our next session is Meet the Mortician. So this is a more practical, I know how to follow that, right? But there are just so many facets, right, of what we deal with in life, from our thinking to the practical parts. You know, as a notary, I'm certainly talking to people about advanced care planning, creating their wills for that final event of death, because we need to deal with our stuff and our people. And so, so this is part. I often will see a lot of people who are doing the practical part of dealing with their bodies. But this is a chance to sort of get in and talk to about what's going on, and just get a sense of that world. If you don't know anybody, it's just a chance to gain more information. So thank you all. I'm going to bid you all farewell. Have a wonderful day. Have a light day, and happy fall. Bye.
Thank you, Deborah.